In the annals of Spanish history, few monarchs have earned such universal condemnation as Ferdinand VII, a ruler whose very name became synonymous with treachery, cruelty, and national destruction. Known to his contemporaries and to history as El Rey Felon, the Felon King, Ferdinand VII represents perhaps the most catastrophic example of absolute monarchy run amok, a man whose personal failings and moral bankruptcy brought Spain to the brink of complete collapse. The roots of Ferdinand's toxic nature can be traced back to his earliest years in a royal court that was itself a cesspit of dysfunction and moral decay. Born in 1778, Ferdinand entered a world where his own parents, King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa, had established themselves as weak rulers dominated by their favorite, Manuel Godoy. This was not merely political incompetence, but a complete abdication of royal dignity that would leave lasting scars on the young prince's understanding of power and loyalty. The Spanish court of Ferdinand's youth was a place where traditional values had been abandoned in favor of personal pleasure and political expedience. His father, Charles IV, was a well-meaning but utterly ineffectual monarch who preferred hunting to governing a vast empire. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was widely believed to be conducting an affair with Godoy, a former royal guard who had risen to become the most powerful man in Spain through his intimate relationship with the royal family. This scandalous arrangement was an open secret throughout Europe, making Spain a laughingstock and teaching young Ferdinand that power could be obtained through manipulation and the complete abandonment of moral principles. Growing up in this environment, Ferdinand learned early that loyalty was a weakness to be exploited, and that family bonds meant nothing when personal advantage was at stake. The young prince watched as his mother openly favored her lover over her husband, as his father meekly accepted his humiliation, and as the entire Spanish nobility either participated in or quietly tolerated this degradation of royal authority. These formative experiences would shape Ferdinand's character in the most destructive possible way, teaching him that betrayal was not only acceptable but necessary for survival and success. The first major manifestation of Ferdinand's treacherous nature came in 1807 with the El Escorial conspiracy, an event that would establish the pattern of betrayal that would define his entire life. By this time, Ferdinand had reached his late 20s and had grown increasingly resentful of his parents' rule and their continued reliance on Godoy. The prince began secretly meeting with a group of nobles who shared his opposition to the existing regime, including the Duke of San Carlos and other high-ranking aristocrats who had grown disgusted with Spain's humiliating subservience to Napoleon's France. The conspiracy involved secret letters, clandestine meetings, and grandiose plans to overthrow Godoy and potentially even remove Charles IV from the throne. Ferdinand threw himself into these plots with enthusiasm, seeing them as his path to power. However, when the conspiracy was inevitably discovered in October 1807, Ferdinand's response revealed the depths of his cowardice and treachery. Rather than standing by his co-conspirators and accepting responsibility for his actions, Ferdinand immediately collapsed under pressure and betrayed everyone who had trusted him. When confronted by his father, the prince fell to his knees, begged for forgiveness, and provided detailed information about all the other participants in the conspiracy. This was not merely an act of cowardice, but a calculated betrayal that destroyed the lives and careers of men who had risked everything to support him. The Duke of San Carlos and other conspirators faced imprisonment and exile, while Ferdinand escaped punishment by sacrificing his allies. This betrayal established a pattern that would repeat throughout Ferdinand's life. He would inspire loyalty in others, encourage them to take risks on his behalf, and then abandon them completely when the situation became dangerous. It was a form of moral cowardice, so profound that it shocked even the cynical Spanish court, marking Ferdinand as fundamentally untrustworthy. The consequences of the El Escorial conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate fate of the conspirators. Ferdinand's betrayal had revealed him to be a man without honor or loyalty, someone who would sacrifice anyone to preserve his own position. More immediately, the conspiracy had further destabilized an already weak Spanish government at precisely the moment when the country faced its greatest external threat in centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte had been watching the Spanish situation with growing interest and contempt. The French emperor saw in Spain's internal divisions and weak leadership an opportunity to extend his continental system and eliminate one of the last potential sources of resistance to his dominance of Europe. The El Escorial conspiracy provided Napoleon with exactly the pretext he needed to intervene directly in Spanish affairs. The situation reached its climax in March 1808 with the tumult of Oranges, an event that would demonstrate Ferdinand's willingness to destroy his own country in pursuit of personal power. Popular discontent with Godoy's rule had been building for years, fueled by military disasters, economic hardship, and the humiliating alliance with France. When news spread that the royal family was preparing to flee to the Americas to escape the French threat, the Spanish people finally rose in revolt. The uprising began in the royal residence of Aranjuez, where an angry mob surrounded the palace demanding Godoy's removal and Charles IV's abdication. Ferdinand, seeing his opportunity, actively encouraged the revolt against his own father. Rather than attempting to mediate or find a solution that would preserve Spanish independence, Ferdinand threw his support behind the mob and pushed for his father's immediate abdication. This was not patriotic opposition to an unpopular minister, but a son's active participation in the humiliation and overthrow of his own father. When Charles IV finally capitulated and abdicated in favor of Ferdinand, the new king's first act was not to address Spain's dire situation or prepare for the looming French threat, but to order the arrest and brutal treatment of Godoy. The former favorite was dragged from his hiding place, beaten by the mob, and imprisoned under conditions that nearly cost him his life. Ferdinand watched this violence with satisfaction, seeing it as confirmation of his own power, rather than as a warning about the dangers of popular unrest. Ferdinand's behavior during the tumult of Aranjuez revealed several key aspects of his character that would define his later rule. He showed a complete willingness to use popular violence to achieve his political goals, regardless of broader consequences for social order. He demonstrated that he valued personal revenge over national interests, focusing on punishing his enemies rather than addressing Spain's real problems. Finally, he showed that he had no understanding of or respect for the traditional bonds of family loyalty that were supposed to be sacred in a monarchical system. The new King Ferdinand VII entered Madrid in triumph, hailed by crowds who saw him as a potential savior from the disasters of his father's reign. However, this popular enthusiasm would prove tragically misplaced, as Ferdinand's first actions revealed him to be every bit as incompetent as his father, but with the added dimension of active malice. Rather than using his newfound authority to prepare Spain for the coming French invasion, Ferdinand spent his time settling personal scores and indulging in the petty ceremonies of power. It was at this crucial moment that Napoleon sprung his trap. The French emperor had been carefully observing the Spanish situation, and he recognized that Ferdinand's character made him the perfect target for manipulation. Napoleon invited both Ferdinand and his father Charles to meet with him at Bayonne, ostensibly to mediate their dispute and recognize Ferdinand's legitimacy as king. This invitation represented one of the most cynical and effective pieces of diplomatic deception in European history. Despite warnings from his advisors about the dangers of leaving Spain at such a critical moment, Ferdinand eagerly accepted Napoleon's invitation. The prospect of international recognition and the opportunity to humiliate his father proved irresistible to the new king. Ferdinand seems to have genuinely believed that his personal charm and political acumen would allow him to outmaneuver the man who had conquered most of Europe. This delusion revealed not only Ferdinand's complete lack of understanding about international politics, but also his fundamental narcissism and inability to assess situations realistically. The journey to Bayonne in April 1808 represented the final act in Ferdinand's betrayal of Spain. As the king traveled north toward the French border, he was accompanied by cheering crowds who still believed he might be their salvation. These loyal Spaniards had no way of knowing that their king was willingly walking into a trap that would leave their country without legitimate leadership at the moment of its greatest crisis. When Ferdinand arrived at Bayonne, he found himself completely outmatched by Napoleon's political sophistication and ruthless pragmatism. The French emperor had no intention of recognizing Ferdinand's legitimacy or negotiating any kind of compromise. Instead, Napoleon systematically stripped away all of Ferdinand's illusions and forced him to confront the reality of his situation. Within days of his arrival, Ferdinand found himself a virtual prisoner, completely dependent on Napoleon's goodwill. When Napoleon demanded that he abdicate in favor of Joseph Bonaparte, Ferdinand initially refused with great theatrical displays of patriotic outrage. However, when it became clear that Napoleon was prepared to use force and that Ferdinand had no real options, the Spanish king's resistance crumbled completely. Rather than choosing to die as a martyr for Spanish independence, Ferdinand meekly signed away his throne and accepted Napoleon's offer of comfortable exile in France. This abdication was not merely a political surrender, but a moral collapse that would haunt Ferdinand for the rest of his life. By voluntarily giving up his throne to a foreign conqueror, Ferdinand had committed what many Spaniards regarded as the ultimate act of treason. He had placed his personal safety and comfort above his duty to his people and his country. The 6 years that Ferdinand spent in comfortable captivity at the Che de Valence, while Spain fought desperately for its independence, represent perhaps the most damning period of his entire life. While Spanish guerrillas died in mountain passes, while cities were besieged and populations massacred, while the entire Spanish Empire began to crumble, Ferdinand lived in luxury as Napoleon's pampered prisoner. He was provided with a magnificent residence, excellent food, and even female companionship. In return, all he had to do was refrain from encouraging Spanish resistance to French rule. Ferdinand's behavior during his captivity revealed the true depths of his selfishness and moral cowardice. Rather than using his position to secretly support Spanish resistance, Ferdinand focused entirely on his personal comfort and safety. He wrote fawning letters to Napoleon, expressing gratitude for his treatment and even offering to marry one of the French emperor's relatives. These letters provide devastating evidence of Ferdinand's complete lack of patriotic feeling or personal honor. Meanwhile, Spain was experiencing one of the most heroic periods in its entire history. The Spanish people, abandoned by their king and facing the most powerful military force in Europe, rose in spontaneous resistance that would ultimately contribute to Napoleon's downfall. The guerrilla warfare that developed during the Peninsular War became a model for resistance movements throughout Europe. Cities like Saragossa and Girona became symbols of heroic resistance, their populations enduring horrific sieges rather than submitting to foreign rule. The contrast between Ferdinand's comfortable captivity and his people's suffering could not have been more stark. While Spanish women and children died of starvation in besieged cities, Ferdinand dined on fine French cuisine. While Spanish guerrillas froze in mountain caves, Ferdinand enjoyed the warmth of his chaise too. While Spanish patriots faced execution for their resistance activities, Ferdinand wrote letters pledging his loyalty to the man who had destroyed his country. The Spanish resistance during the Peninsular War created a new form of government in Ferdinand's absence, the Cortes of Cadiz, which drafted Spain's first liberal constitution in 1812. This document, created by Spanish patriots who believed they were acting in Ferdinand's name, established principles of constitutional monarchy, individual rights, and limited government that represented a dramatic break with Spain's absolutist traditions. The irony was profound. While Ferdinand lived comfortably under foreign protection, his supposed subjects were creating a political system designed to limit royal power and protect popular rights. Ferdinand's reaction to news of these developments revealed his complete opposition to any form of constitutional government or popular participation in politics. Even from his comfortable exile, he made it clear that he regarded the Cortes and its constitution as illegitimate usurpations of royal authority. This attitude would have catastrophic consequences when he finally returned to power. The end of Ferdinand's captivity came in 1814 with Napoleon's defeat and abdication. The Spanish king was finally free to return to his country, but the man who crossed the Pyrenees in March 1814 was fundamentally unchanged by his experiences. 6 years of comfortable exile had taught Ferdinand nothing about leadership, patriotism, or the duties of kingship. If anything, his time at Valence had reinforced his worst characteristics by demonstrating that he could survive and even prosper through submission and betrayal. As Ferdinand made his way through Spain toward Madrid, He was greeted by crowds of Spaniards who still hoped that their restored king might prove worthy of the sacrifices made in his name. These loyal subjects had endured years of warfare, occupation, and suffering while believing they were fighting for Ferdinand's restoration. They had created a new political system designed to work with a constitutional monarch who would respect the rights and sacrifices of his people. Their hopes would soon be crushed in the most brutal possible way. Ferdinand's return to Spanish soil in March 1814 marked the beginning of the most catastrophic period of his reign. The Spain that welcomed him back was fundamentally different from the country he had abandoned 6 years earlier. The Peninsular War had transformed Spanish society, creating new political consciousness, new institutions, and new expectations about the relationship between ruler and ruled. Ferdinand, however, remained exactly the same selfish, vindictive, and authoritarian personality he had always been. The first sign of Ferdinand's intentions came even before he reached Madrid. Rather than proceeding directly to the capital to assume his constitutional duties under the liberal constitution of 1812, Ferdinand deliberately took a circuitous route that allowed him to gauge popular opinion and build support for his planned destruction of the constitutional system. At every stop, he was greeted by crowds who had suffered terribly during the French occupation and who looked to their restored king for leadership and justice. These demonstrations of popular loyalty gave Ferdinand a false sense of his own power and convinced him that he could safely ignore the liberal politicians and military officers who had actually fought for Spanish independence. The crowds that cheered him had no way of knowing that their king was already planning to betray the very constitution that Spanish patriots had created in his name. The crucial moment came on May 4th, 1814, when Ferdinand issued a decree that would go down in Spanish history as one of the most catastrophic acts of royal treachery ever committed. With a single document, Ferdinand abolished the Constitution of 1812, dissolved the court-edict that had governed Spain during his absence, declared null and void all the laws and institutions created during the liberal period, and restored the absolute monarchy that had existed before the French invasion. This decree was not merely a political act, but a complete betrayal of everyone who had fought, suffered, and died for Spanish independence. The implications of Ferdinand's decree were staggering in their scope and cruelty. Thousands of Spanish patriots, who had risked their lives fighting French occupation, suddenly found themselves branded as traitors and revolutionaries by the very king they had fought to restore. Military officers who had led guerrilla bands against Napoleon's armies were arrested and imprisoned. Politicians who had created Spain's first constitutional government were forced into exile or faced execution. The speed and thoroughness with which Ferdinand dismantled Spain's constitutional system revealed the extent of his planning and the depth of his hatred for any limitation on royal power. This was not a gradual return to traditional monarchy, but a systematic reign of terror designed to crush every trace of liberal thought and constitutional government. Ferdinand had clearly spent his years in comfortable captivity, not reflecting on his duties as a king, but plotting revenge against anyone who had dared to govern Spain without his permission. The restoration of the Inquisition was perhaps the most shocking aspect of Ferdinand's reactionary program. This medieval institution, which had been abolished by the liberal government, was brought back with all its traditional powers of censorship, persecution, and torture. Ferdinand's decision to restore the Inquisition was not driven by religious conviction, but by his recognition that it provided him with a powerful tool for suppressing dissent and terrorizing his opponents. The persecution that followed Ferdinand's restoration of absolute monarchy was characterized by a level of vindictiveness and cruelty that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to political repression. Ferdinand did not content himself with simply removing his opponents from power. He seemed determined to destroy them personally and to make examples of them that would terrorize anyone else who might consider opposing his rule. One of the most tragic aspects of Ferdinand's reign of terror was the fate of the Spanish military officers who had actually won the war against Napoleon. These men, who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and skill in defeating the most powerful army in Europe, found themselves treated as criminals by the king they had fought to restore. General Francisco Espoz Mina one of the most successful guerrilla leaders of the Peninsular War, was forced into exile. General Joan Decius Porlier, another hero of the independence struggle, was executed for his opposition to Ferdinand's absolutist policies. The systematic persecution of Spain's military heroes had catastrophic consequences for the country's ability to maintain its empire and defend its interests. Ferdinand's purges of the officer corps removed many of Spain's most competent and experienced military leaders at precisely the moment when the country faced rebellions throughout its American colonies. The loss of Spanish America, which occurred during Ferdinand's reign, was directly connected to his destruction of the military and political leadership that might have been able to preserve the empire through reform and negotiation. Ferdinand's treatment of his American colonies revealed the same combination of stupidity, cruelty, and short-sighted selfishness that characterized all his policies. When the Spanish-American independence movements began in earnest after his restoration, Ferdinand's response was to send military expeditions designed to crush the rebellions through force, rather than addressing the legitimate grievances that had sparked them. This approach was not only morally wrong but practically disastrous, as Spain lacked the resources to reconquer territories that had already tasted independence and constitutional government. The loss of Spanish America during Ferdinand's reign represented one of the greatest geopolitical disasters in European history. In the space of little more than a decade, Spain went from being a global empire spanning 4 continents to being a minor European power confined largely to the Iberian Peninsula. This catastrophic decline was not the result of inevitable historical forces, but of Ferdinand's personal failings as a leader. Ferdinand's domestic policies were equally destructive and revealed his complete inability to understand the economic and social changes that Spain needed to modernize and compete with other European powers. Instead of promoting education, industry, and trade, Ferdinand focused obsessively on maintaining traditional social hierarchies and suppressing any form of innovation or progress. The Spanish economy stagnated under his rule, falling further behind the rapid development occurring in other parts of Europe. The political opposition to Ferdinand's absolutist rule began to organize almost immediately after his restoration, despite the severe repression that made such activity extremely dangerous. Liberal conspiracies and military pronunciamientos became a constant feature of Ferdinand's reign, as Spanish patriots who had fought for independence found themselves unable to accept the destruction of constitutional government. The most significant of these liberal uprisings was the Revolution of 1820, led by Colonel Rafael del Riego and other military officers who had been ordered to embark for America to fight against the independence movements there. Instead of sailing to suppress colonial rebellions, these officers proclaimed the Constitution of 1812 and demanded Ferdinand's acceptance of constitutional monarchy. The success of this revolution forced Ferdinand to accept constitutional limits on his power for 3 years. Ferdinand's behavior during the constitutional period from 1820 to 1823 revealed his complete inability to accept any limitations on his authority, and his willingness to betray Spain's interests to foreign powers in order to restore his absolute rule. Rather than working within the constitutional system to address Spain's problems, Ferdinand spent these 3 years plotting with foreign governments to restore his unlimited power. The climax of Ferdinand's treachery during this period came with his active collaboration with the French invasion of 1823, known as the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis. Ferdinand not only welcomed this foreign intervention, but actively assisted it, providing intelligence about Spanish defenses and encouraging French forces to overthrow his own constitutional government. This collaboration with foreign invaders against his own people represented perhaps the ultimate act of royal treason in Spanish history. When the French intervention succeeded in restoring Ferdinand's absolute power in 1823, the king's revenge against the liberals who had forced him to accept constitutional government was swift and brutal. The period from 1823 to 1833, known as the Ominous Decade, saw Ferdinand unleash a reign of terror that surpassed even his earlier repressions in its scope and cruelty. Thousands of liberals were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Ferdinand's final years were marked by increasing desperation as he struggled to find a male heir to continue his dynasty. His fourth marriage, to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies in 1829, finally produced children, but they were daughters rather than the male heir Ferdinand desperately wanted. The birth of Isabella in 1830 and Luisa Fernanda in 1832 created a succession crisis that would plague Spain for decades after Ferdinand's death. The Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, which Ferdinand issued to allow his daughter Isabella to inherit the throne, represented his final act of political manipulation and set the stage for the devastating Carlist Wars that would follow his death. By changing the succession law to favor his daughter over his brother Carlos, Ferdinand ensured that his death would be followed by a civil war that would further devastate Spain. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, leaving behind a Spain that had been systematically destroyed by his policies and his character. The great empire that had once dominated much of the world had been reduced to a minor European power. The constitutional government that Spanish patriots had created during the Peninsular War had been crushed. The military and intellectual leadership that might have guided Spain's modernization had been decimated by persecution and exile. The legacy of Ferdinand VII serves as one of history's most powerful examples of how the personal failings of a single individual can destroy an entire nation. His pattern of betrayal, which began with his treachery against his early conspirators and continued through his collaboration with Napoleon and his persecution of Spanish liberals, created a culture of political instability and violence that would plague Spain for generations. The Fellon king had completed his work of destruction, leaving Spain to struggle with the consequences of his betrayals for decades to come. The aftermath of Ferdinand's reign cast a long shadow over Spanish politics, creating institutional weaknesses that would persist well into the modern era. His systematic dismantling of constitutional governance had established dangerous precedents that future monarchs would exploit, while his betrayal of liberal allies had created deep fissures within Spanish society that proved impossible to heal. The economic consequences of Ferdinand's policies were equally devastating. His restoration of absolutist control had stifled the commercial and industrial development that Spain desperately needed to compete with other European powers. The country's infrastructure remained backward, its educational system underdeveloped, and its military antiquated. These deficiencies would become painfully apparent in subsequent conflicts as Spain struggled to maintain its international standing against more modernized neighbors. Perhaps most tragically, Ferdinand's reign had squandered Spain's opportunity to embrace the democratic ideals that were transforming Europe. While other nations were gradually expanding political participation and individual rights, Spain had retreated into authoritarianism and repression. This regression would have profound implications for Spanish development, as the country fell increasingly behind its European contemporaries in virtually every measure of progress and prosperity. The Fellon king's legacy also extended to Spain's relationship with its former American colonies. His harsh treatment of colonial independence movements had poisoned diplomatic relations and foreclosed opportunities for mutually beneficial economic partnerships. Instead of maintaining profitable commercial ties with the newly independent nations, Spain found itself isolated and excluded from the lucrative American markets that could have revitalized its economy. Ferdinand's impact on Spanish culture and intellectual life was similarly destructive. His censorship policies and persecution of liberal thinkers had created an atmosphere of fear and conformity that stifled creativity and innovation. Many of Spain's brightest minds had fled into exile, taking their talents and ideas to other countries where they could contribute to progress and enlightenment. This brain drain would handicap Spanish development for generations. The religious dimension of Ferdinand's reign also left lasting scars. His alliance with conservative Catholic forces had reinforced Spain's isolation from the broader currents of European thought and culture. While other nations were experiencing religious reform and intellectual awakening, Spain remained trapped in rigid orthodoxy that discouraged questioning and experimentation. Even Ferdinand's supporters eventually recognized the destructive nature of his rule. Many conservatives who had initially welcomed his restoration came to understand that his policies had weakened rather than strengthen traditional institutions. His arbitrary exercise of power had undermined respect for law and order, while his betrayals had destroyed trust in royal authority. The international community's assessment of Ferdinand was equally harsh. European diplomats and observers consistently described him as unreliable, vindictive, and short-sighted. His reputation for treachery made Spain a pariah among nations, complicating diplomatic relations and isolating the country from beneficial alliances and partnerships. Ferdinand VII's reign thus represents one of the most damaging periods in Spanish history, a time when personal vindictiveness and political short-sightedness combined to inflict lasting harm on the nation and its people.